The Problem of Enchantment. Poor Griese Otakar. Preface. If someone had dared to write seriously about the possibility of enchantment a few years ago, their sanity would certainly have been questioned. Today, however, when scientific occultism is conquering one position after another over materialistic positivism, when the latest researches in the field of chemistry confirm the previously much-mocked alchemical theories, when astrology, discredited to the highest degree by impostors, with its undeniable divination facts and mathematical accuracy, celebrates true triumphs over the prejudice of the representatives of official science, today when spiritualism and hypnotism have partially blown away the veil of admirable humanity's secrets of the magic of ancient and medieval necromancy. In today's era, the tables have turned, and occult researchers seek public opinion themselves, if it is reasonable to reject facts and theories based on them just because they seem to contradict the current knowledge of exact science. The claim that occult researchers are ahead of official science, that the facts presented by them are not guaranteed, poorly controlled, that observers are victims of hallucinations, fraud, etc., all in vain. The secret sciences prove with their strict logic and experimentally the unsustainability and shakiness of their sophisms and draw their former biggest opponents to themselves as if by magical power. The time has come for the general revival of the sciences with a living wave of occult truths, which no one can hold back. Enchantment, a word in general speech, novels, novellas, etc., quite frequently used, and yet so unusual and strange-sounding in a study that is supposed to justify it scientifically and capture its true meaning for occult practice. What is enchantment? It is the influence of one person by another person, usually without the first being aware, in order to achieve certain effects, physiological or psychological, by means of certain means, perhaps little known until now, but just as justified in their effectiveness as a number of other agents recognized by science. Can it really be done to someone? We have to answer the question here only in the affirmative. Experiences in general life so far and attempts made in this direction at least entitle us to such an answer. And our new publication solves the problem of enchantment in such a way that everyone, without exception, can see for himself, experimentally, the correctness of the theory of enchantment. To those who have read my previous work on mummial hermetic healing, some of the things I discuss in this study will be somewhat familiar, since both mummial hermetic healing and enchantment share to some extent a common agent, which is the ode. In mummification treatment and during enchantment, it is an effect on the radiated ode. In mummification treatment, the healing ode of a certain mineral, plant, or animal acts on the sick person. During enchantment, a psychological factor also joins such a purely physiological process, i.e. the will of the enchanter, which in many cases can replace the action of mummification, being itself the only telenergically acting factor causing enchantment effects. However, there are some operations in which the will of the operator is not involved, or only very slightly, as is the case with love charms using the so-called filters, when only the chemical and/or chemicalotic properties of the filter material affect the victim. Some modern French researchers claim that the principle of old, namely medieval enchantment practices, was not to act on the radiated ode, but to directly invoke the astral of the targeted victim for the purpose of enchantment. Although the possibility of evocative enchantments is not excluded from the occult point of view, the method and in general the entire procedure of the enchantment operations of old sorcerers, as can be seen from the preserved traditions and written documents, had such a prominent mummified character that they cannot be considered as purely evocative actions. The most recent experiments of Colonel de Roche's directly categorically point to the analogy of his experiments with medieval practices, and we may boldly say that this ingenious investigator was the first who carefully collected the vast material of ancient works and manuscripts, compared them with the modern researches obtained in the field of this branch of occultism, and on the basis of such a difficult comparative study, supported abundantly by the experiments of his own and other investigators, constructed a theory of enchantment which has not yet been elaborated, not even precisely determined, on firm feet. Let's just notice the things with which the medieval wizard worked, and we will find striking similarities with the objects used by de Roches in his laboratory. Wax, eggs, hair, nails, blood, pus, worn clothes, etc., the tools of old wizards and de Roches. More on that in another place. Here I want to point out that the purpose of this study is not to decide whether mummification elements or evocative practices were at work in historical bewitchment, since both probably occurred, but to prove that bewitchment, be it in one way or another, is possible and experimentally proven nowadays. Depending on whether there is an element of will or mummy involved in the bewitchment, we distinguish mental and mummy bewitchment. Enchantment in which both elements work, and there were and still are probably the most cases, is mental mummial enchantment. We can also include evocative enchantments in this category. To the history of enchantment can be said that the practices of enchanting have been carried out since ancient times. According to Helena Blavatsky, it was the Atlanteans who perished only as a result of their black magical actions. But let's stay in the historical epoch of mankind. Even the first representatives of Eastern occultism, the Akkadians and the Chaldeans, must have been well aware of conjuring operations with the help of images and statuettes, for in almost all their incantatory formulas they warn against the image maker. Quite naturally, the old teachings of magic were passed down from generation to generation, until at a later time, due to the contact of European travelers with the Orientals, they became the basis of European occultism, cultivated then only rarely and secretly in monasteries. The Arab historian Ben Khaldun, living in the 14th century, writes as an eyewitness of the Nabatean sorcerers on the lower Euphrates as follows. We saw with our own eyes how a sorcerer made a statue of the person he wanted to bewitch. Such figurines are made of materials whose quality is governed by the sorcerer's intentions and plans, and whose symbolic meaning harmonizes to a certain extent with the name and status of his victim. He placed before him a statuette or picture which was supposed to represent the victim actually or symbolically, spoke some mysterious words over it, and spat on it. Upon this he stretched the rope already prepared over this symbolic image, making a knot, by which he meant to indicate that he was acting decisively and persistently, and that he was joining with the demon, who at the moment of spitting supported him in his action, and that he further proved that he had a firm intention not to undo the enchantment. Egyptian and Assyrian rituals also contain places that directly refer to enchanting practices using images and statuettes. Lenormand, in his work Magic Among the Chaldeans and the Akkadian Origins, reproduces one tablet from the royal palace in Nineveh, which contains 28 supplicatory incantations against the action of evil spirits, against accidents and diseases. Incantations are written in the form of litanies. So, for example, the 6th verse reads, "Protect us, Spirit of Heaven. Protect us, Spirit of the earth. Before those who make a face, who bewitch before the evil face, the evil eye, the evil tongue, the evil lips, the evil word." Through contact with the Egyptians, even the Jews learned their black art, who, despite the draconian laws of Moses, secretly cultivated them. Even in India, the cradle of the most beautiful occult philosophical systems, black magic was not unknown, but the innate ascetic and deeply religious nature of the Indians was a natural bulwark against the pernicious spread of Egyptian Chaldean evil. Platon, who in the book of his laws he says, among other things, the following: "It is really useless to persuade very prejudiced persons not to be alarmed by the little wax figures which have been placed before their doors, at the crossroads, or on the grave of their ancestors, and to admonish them not to notice them, for they blindly believe in such enchantments." And who does not know from the Greek history of the Thessalian witches, who daily pierced the head of the person they wanted to slowly kill with a needle made of wax? Operations with wax figures were also known to the Romans. Thus the Roman poet Ovid reminds us of them in one place in his Heroids in relation to the legendary daughter of the Colchidian king Aeetes. Medea says, "He curses the absent and fashions wax figures and presses slender needles into the wretched liver." The Christians were the direct heirs of the pagan occult traditions, who in many respects surpassed their pagan predecessors. They very often combined all kinds of blasphemous practices with the basic bewitching act, such as giving sacrilegious sacraments to a wax statue, consecration, wrapping the statue in church robes, etc. I will explain why they did such seemingly senseless things in another place. Here I will mention a few more cases of enchantment from past centuries, about which we have preserved written accounts and which are mentioned by de Roches in his work The Exteriorization of Sensitivity. So it is said about King Duff of Scotland that he died as a result of the magical manipulation of a witch who melted his wax figure in a pan every day. In 1317, John XXII, the second Pope of Avignon, wrote that his enemies wanted to bewitch him. The magicians Jacob, called Brabankin, and John of Amanta, a physician, prepared drinks with which they wanted to poison me and several cardinals, our brothers. Unable to give us these drinks, they made wax statues, which they baptized with our names, and stabbing these, they threatened our lives, but God us protected, for 3 of these devilish statues fell into our hands. In 1333, Robert of Artois was accused of trying to bewitch the wife and son of Philip VI of Valois. The court, which was held at the Court of Justice in the Louvre, was presided over by the king himself. The original files of this trial can be found in the Royal Archives. During the reign of Henry IV, Cardinal Winchester accused the wife of the Duke of Gloucester, whom he was jealous of for the king's favor, of witchcraft. He managed to obtain witnesses who confirmed that the Duchess met very often with a priest accused of necromancy and a witch, Maria Gardemain. Witnesses assured under oath that the 3 of them were performing diabolical tricks, that they were melting a wax figure representing Henry IV on fire, thus draining his strength and taking his life. As soon as the wax was consumed, Henry was supposed to die. Despite the defendants claiming their innocence and the Duchess being of high birth, all 3 were found guilty, the Duchess sentenced to life imprisonment, the priest hanged, and the witch burned. In the 2nd volume of the Dog Days, written by Simon Mayol de Ast, Bishop of Valtour, we find the story of a lady who was threatened by a witch to do. After a few days, the lady felt terrible pains in her stomach, as if someone was stabbing her intestines at intervals. She disturbed the whole neighborhood with her terrible moaning. There she was visited by a certain potter who said that she was bewitched. He had the threshold examined, where, among other magical things, a wax figure pierced with a needle was found. When everything was thrown into the fire, the lady recovered. Cardinal gives us an account of the trial before the Senate of Savoy in 1723. in which Count André Philibert of Pliors in the Duchy of Aosta was sentenced to death for trying to kill his wife with a wax figure that he was melting on fire. The case that Desroches narrates is no less interesting, and which is all the more remarkable because Desroches knows the people involved. A certain poor girl J. wished to marry a very rich relative despite the fact that he was 40 years older. His sister L. opposed the intended marriage, as her children would have lost a considerable inheritance. In distress, the girl in question and her sister B. turned to a woman who was a proclaimed witch for advice. The woman to whom they first came immediately told them that one of them wanted to get married, but that a certain lady did not want the marriage, who, after all, could be got rid of without having to leave the house. They both thought it was a joke, but Sister J., who was very pampered and curious, absolutely wanted to see how the witch would do with such a job. So she was left alone with the witch. The latter showed her the wax statue, asked the name of the lady in question, baptized the statue with that name, and handing Miss J. a pin, ordered her to pierce the statue. Miss J. poked this one in the stomach. That same evening, the two sisters dined at their relative's house, to whom a telegraphic message had just been delivered that Mrs. L. had died suddenly in the morning at church. Naturally, both girls were very moved by this. A few days later, they learned that Mrs. L. had died of a ruptured intestine. Enchantment is still practiced in the French province of Béarn today. Provost Byrabin writes the following about it. If an enemy seizes a little of the water you have touched, your tresses, or your clothes, you are in great danger of being bewitched. Things taken secretly must be the substance of the volt, and it is a very serious matter. The sorcerer will urinate your hair or other substance taken from you in a container of water, after which he will expose the container to the moonlight for 3 days. To do this, he takes an egg, removes the white through a small hole and replaces it with a volti. Then he seals the opening with a wax seal with a sign. After that he buries the thus prepared egg in a lonely place, saying the following words: "Run, run, run, howl like a dog, and above all suffer very much." The victim, alerted to this action by a prick on the left side, immediately performs a counteraction. He takes the heart from a freshly slaughtered sheep, hangs it on an iron hook and drives nails through it. He often hangs them over the hearth and says over it the words, "Run, quickly run back where you came from." However, there are even more complicated cases, as Stanislas de Guaita writes in his work The Temple of Satan. He says, "The volti in a magical enchantment is the waxen face of the person to be destroyed. The more faithful the likeness, the greater the chance of success. If the sorcerer, in making the volti, can mix into it a few drops of holy oil or pieces of the consecrated host, then the nails, teeth, or hair of his victim, he is convinced that he has just as many trump cards in his criminal game. If he succeeds to take away some of the clothes that the victim has been wearing for a long time, and to dress the statuette in it, if possible, in the way that the victim herself is dressed, that the statue is pricked with poisoned needles and pelted with all the greatest insults in order to arouse demonic resentment. Or in certain mysterious hours the statue is wounded with shards of glass, from which rotten blood drips. The wax volt, which is baptized in the name of the victim, is bound by the same the toad with the hair taken from the victim, after which it spits on it and buries itself under the threshold or in some other place which the victim must frequently visit. Dr. Bodley tells of a magical match between Albert Pike, a Masonic Grand Master, and Dr. Gorgas, a physician at the University of Baltimore and president of the Scottish Rite of Descent. Albert Pike usually enchanted with the help of a wax figure, hair, nails, etc. If he did not have these, he sought to seize some pieces of his enemy's clothing. In the case with Dr. Gorgasm received a handkerchief from his laundress. He immersed such a mummified substance in a strong saline solution. While pouring salt into the water, he said the words, Sagrapim mel ankt ebo rostamauk Elias fog. For this he dried the cloth over a fire sustained by magnolia branches. For 3 weeks then, every Saturday, he invoked Moloch, holding a cloth in outstretched hands, as if the invoked demon was present and offered it to him. At the third council, at 7 o'clock in the afternoon, he burnt the substance in question on a spirit cauldron, while singing diabolical songs of his own composition, and collected the ashes on a plate of lead, on which were engraved various hieroglyphics with a knife dedicated to Lucifer. That day he did not eat any food until 3 o'clock, and his entire lunch consisted of fish, biscuit, and dried fruit. The next day he modeled a statuette, which he called Dagidu from wax, into which he mixed the ashes of that substance. Dagida Gorgasova was 30 centimeters tall. Pike, however, did not prick the statuette with a needle, nor did he melt it on the fire, but placed it under a vacuum, from which he sucked the air. The bewitched person then felt a strange nausea, the causes of which she could not explain. Anyone who would think that charm practices are no longer practiced today would be wrong. I very often receive letters in which people turn to me with a request for help against enemies who, they say, magically send all kinds of accidents, diseases, and misfortunes to them. However, in most cases, these are only unsubstantiated assumptions, born in the morbidly irritated brains of individuals who, not knowing the true causes of the evil befalling them, attribute them to mysterious causes. Only in 2 cases was it possible to detect the magical counteraction of the bewitching effect. Part 1. Mental Enchantment. Chapter 1. Hypnotism and Suggestion. Since in the second part, a number of phenomena conditioned by the hypnotic state will be studied, and since, on the other hand, so-called suggestion plays a considerable role in bewitchment, I think that I will not deviate too much from my own subject if I give here a slightly more extensive explanation of hypnotism and suggestion and instructions for conducting experiments. Hypnotism is a science that studies the phenomena of so-called hypnosis, i.e., a special state induced by hypnotic means. The word hypnosis is derived from the Greek hypnos, sleep, but this is not the main sign of hypnosis, but an increased sensitivity to suggestions. A suggestion is a process that arises in an individual by evoking a certain idea by himself or by a stranger. It is actually the result of the categorical imposition of some idea. Not only individuals, but entire masses, societies, and nations can be influenced by suggestion. If an idea is evoked in an individual by a stranger, it is heterosuggestion. If the individual suggests an idea to himself, we have to do with autosuggestion. In a narrower sense, a suggestion is any command given to an experimental person, i.e., a hypnotized person, behind the cause of its realization. However, the hypnotic state does not have to be a condition for the realization of a certain suggestion, because even with normal consciousness a person can be influenced and instilled or suggested to him a certain idea, in the sense of which the person in question then acts. Thus, even during normal wakefulness, we find a certain degree of suggestibility in a person, i.e., a disposition to accept a suggestion. We give suggestions in a variety of ways, such as words, gestures, writing, or even mentally with a thought. The suggestion should be clear, distinct, and easily understandable to the subject. If a suggestion of an effect does not sometimes appear, especially during the initial attempts at hypnotism, it must be repeated several times or deliver it in a more or less commanding tone. We recognize pre-hypnotic, hypnotic, and post-hypnotic suggestion. A pre-hypnotic suggestion is one that is given before inducing hypnosis, e.g., we suggest to a subject who is currently in a normal state that he will fall asleep peacefully in 5 minutes. A hypnotic suggestion is given only when the subject has already fallen into a hypnotic state. If we suggest to the experimental person that after the end of hypnosis, i.e. already in a normal state, he performs some performance, for example to go to a store 2 hours after waking up and do a certain thing there, this is a post-hypnotic suggestion. Every suggestion eventually turns into an autosuggestion, i.e. it dominates the brain centers, the result of which is the evoking of an appropriate image. What is actually applied here is more or less faith in suggestion, which is the key to the whole realization secret of suggestion. If we consider that suggestion can also cause anatomical changes in an organism, such as swelling, blisters, bleeding, paralysis, etc., we will understand how important it can be in human life and how it can be misused. Perhaps more cases of medieval enchantment are due to criminal suggestion than we think. More on that in another place. How can you be hypnotized? There are more hypnotic methods, of which I will mention only the most important ones. The Burger method. This is very simple and consists in the fact that the hypnotist warms his hands and holds them in front of the subject's head. The Bernheim method. After instructing the subject about the purpose of the procedure, we let him stare intently at the fingers we hold in front of his nasal bridge. We prepare our thoughts appropriately for sleep as follows. 1. Think of nothing but sleep. 2. Your eyes are tired, your lids are trembling. 3. A general lassitude seizes you. 4. Hands and feet lose sensation. 5. Eyes tear, sight dim. 6. Close your eyes tight. 7. Okay. You can't open them now. 8. You fall asleep. The braid method. We instruct the subject to look intently and concentratedly at some shiny object that we hold in one hand in front of his eyes, slightly above the eye horizon at a distance of about 35 centimeters. The Eulenberg method. This depends on the fact that we galvanize the head, as a result of which the subject soon falls asleep. Ferriot's method. We try to concentrate the subject's attention as much as possible, after which we suddenly shout sleep. Or we instruct the experimental person to look sharply into the palm of his hand without blinking, after which, observing that his eyelids tremble, we slowly approach his hand at a small distance to his eyes. The method is fascinating. We instruct the subject to look into our eyes, which alone is sometimes enough to induce a hypnotic state. We usually also use verbal suggestions here. The Hayden-Hain method. Place a strongly ticking pocket watch on the subject's ear or neck. In a short time, the subject falls asleep. Charcot method. This is one of the most dangerous. We suddenly turn on a very intense light in front of an unsuspecting subject, or we suddenly hit a bell, a tuning fork, etc. The Lazegny method. We instruct the test person to close their eyes, after which we begin to slightly press the eyeball with our fingers. Liebolt method. We put our hand on the subject's forehead and slowly push his eyes. We use Bernheim suggestions, omitting the 2nd, 5th, 6th, and 7th sentences. The voice must become quieter and quieter. The Lies method. This method is excellent, and it has the advantage that the hypnotist does not get tired with it since it does not depend on him. It consists in the fact that the subject looks intently into a special device consisting of two mirrors that rotate very quickly in opposite directions. The device is called miroir rotatif, and it is mainly used in America. It can be used to hypnotize a large number of people very easily. Many attribute a harmful influence to this method. Magnetic method. Although some researchers attribute the effects of this method to mere suggestion, it cannot always be said that way. This is evidenced by the numerous experiments carried out at the present time by the professor of the French School of Healing with Animal Magnetism, Derville. We rub the subject's body with a horseshoe-shaped or stick magnet, while standing on the head, solar plexus, knees and toes for a few moments. Mesmer's method. Standing in front of the test person, we raise our hands in an arc above his head, after which, at a distance of about 3 to 5 centimeters from the body, we stretch our hands from the head down to the feet, while the tips of the fingers stand for a few moments on the eyes, breast, pit of the stomach, and knees. We repeat the manipulation 15 to 20 times. Or, according to another method of Mesmerov, we close the fingers of the left hand in a conical shape, hold them in the landscape of the solar plexus, and with the fingers of the other hand we rub the crown or the root of the nose strongly. The Petrusov method. We lightly rub the so-called hypnogenic zones, i.e. certain places on the body, such as the forehead, temples, root of the nose, and the pit of the stomach. Riche's method. With warm hands, we make simple strokes from the crown to the stomach area. Professor Riche claims that with this method he managed to hypnotize many people in a short time. The Weinhold method. Lightly brush the temples with a faradic current. The Indian method. In a dark room, we place the undressed subject on the bed, stand by his head and, looking straight into his eyes, blow lightly into his nose. One hand rests on the pit of her stomach, the other lightly rubs her body. The room must be quiet and no one can be present during the experiment. Or we circle the subject's head quickly around. If we want to wake up a sleeping experimental person, we have to act very calmly, circumspectly, and carefully. Since hypnosis is a forcefully induced state, i.e. to a certain extent unnatural, it can cause minor or major discomforts, such as nausea, headache, dizziness, fainting, etc. For this reason, it is necessary to take care of this in order to avoid such phenomena if possible. Waking up the experimental person by violent, overly drastic means such as pouring water, forcibly opening the eyelids, pinching, electrifying, etc., must be rejected, as such means have adverse effects on the human psyche. It is best to wake the subject with a well-chosen suggestion, something like this: "Now I will wake you up. On the count of 3, you will wake up without any feeling of languor or heaviness. You will feel the weakness disappearing. We will now make several strokes over the whole body. When you wake up, you will feel strong, refreshed, in a good mood." As soon as the subject responds that he feels no difficulty, we continue. 1. The flabbiness and heaviness disappear. 2. The good mood returns. 3. You have woken up and you are fine. Rarely does the hypnosis last longer after such an awakening procedure. If the subject cannot be awakened in the manner mentioned above, we must not immediately lose our composure, because fear, faint-heartedness, and restlessness in general have a harmful effect on the subject, whose sensitivity has been greatly increased by hypnotic sleep. Convulsions and nervous attacks can often only be attributed to an agitated hypnotist. We calmly turn the sleeping person when he wakes up. If he says that in half an hour or in an hour, we will let him sleep peacefully. If he says that in 3, 4 or even more hours, we will tell him that it is not possible, that the circumstances do not allow him to sleep that long, and we will order him ourselves when to wake up. It is often enough to say "wake up" to the sleeping person to break the hypnosis. Blowing gently on the lids also has the same effect. However, if the sleeping person resists all these measures, we let him sleep peacefully until he wakes up on his own. Several stages can be identified in hypnosis, the most important of which are the cataleptic, lethargic, and somnambulistic stages. Although many researchers say that similar stages do not occur in hypnosis or only very rarely, the statement is not quite justified, since most of the older and modern experimenters have determined the symptoms of these stages. I will limit myself to a brief listing of the most important symptoms, so that even the layman can get a more definite, albeit still very rough and insufficient picture of hypnosis. Details can be found in the relevant professional files, of which there are quite a few these days. In catalepsy, the hypnotized person is motionless. The expression of the eyes, which are open and often tearful, is stiff, the eyelids tremble, and the limbs remain motionless in the position we have given them. There is no increased musculomuscular irritability, only illegibility appears here compared to the pain. The senses, especially sight and hearing, remain somewhat active. The operator can induce various hallucinations and automatic movements. If the subject closes, for example, the left eye, the left side falls into the lethargic stage. If he closes both eyes, the lethargic state itself occurs. The same effect is achieved if the subject is transferred to a dark room. In lethargy, the subject shows complete insensitivity to pain, but is rarely controlled by suggestion. The hand raised aloft falls limply down. There is increased motor muscular irritability. If we irritate a nerve, for example, the muscle associated with it will respond by contracting. Muscle contraction can also be caused by its direct irritation. By lightly rubbing the temples or pressing on the forehead, we will bring the experimental person from the above-mentioned stages to the somnambulistic stage. The subject's eyes are half or completely closed, nerves and muscles do not respond to stimulation, memory is sharpened. There is also insensitivity to pain, but a morbidly heightened perception of certain impressions. Since sight, hearing, and smell are active, the subject can be completely controlled by suggestion. If we press lightly on the subject's cornea, the somnambulic state changes into lethargy. In addition to these main stages, there are still a number of intermediate stages bearing, in addition to signs reminiscent of some of the stages listed here, also special signs. An interesting phenomenon is the relationship that develops between the subject and the hypnotist after more frequent hypnotism, which is called rapport. This initially manifests itself in the fact that the subject is unable to answer the question to anyone other than his hypnotist. The next level of rapport is psychological dependence on the hypnotist, manifested by the fact that the subject sees, hears and feels only what the hypnotist sees, hears and feels, or what the hypnotist tells him to perceive. The subject then perceives no one else but his hypnotist, and if the rapport is strengthened even more by further experiments, it develops in such a way that the subject perceives all the feelings and impressions of the hypnotist, so that it can truly be said that he perceives with his own senses and even reads his thoughts. If the rapport has reached this stage, then no one will put the subject to sleep or wake up, but the hypnotist working with him. No less interesting are the phenomena of hypnotic suggestion. Thus, if we put the test person's limbs in a certain position, we will induce a corresponding expression in the face of that position. If, for example, we clench the subject's hands into fists, as people usually do in anger, the subject looks angry. If we clasp her hands as if in prayer, an expression of piety will appear on the face. If the hypnotist suggests to the subject that he cannot move from his place, there is no getting up. Or if we suggest to the experimental person that he is another person or even an animal, he shows the same habits, customs, the same facial features, movements, voice, and even speech of the being with whom we have, so to speak, identified him. If we further suggest to her that some of the persons present in the room are not found, the subject does not observe them, even if they were standing in front of her. If such a person, unperceived by the subject, would set himself on fire, e.g. cigar, the subject tells us with astonishment that he observes a burning cigar moving in the air. Suggestion can also affect the muscular system, blood circulation, and heart activity. So we put a piece of moistened paper on the subject's hand and tell her that it is a stretching plaster. A blister will appear in that place in a short or longer time. Applying a piece of cold iron to her hand, we say that it is a hot iron, we produce a red spot on the hand, and even an ulcer as from a real burn. This also includes the so-called stigmata, i.e. periodic bleeding from certain places on the body, which was previously considered a miracle and which is actually just the effect of intensive religious suggestion. For hypnotic practice, you must remember the following main principles. We are not to hypnotize anyone without their permission. We hypnotize only in the presence of the father, mother, husband, or other trusted person. Without permission, let's not suggest to the experimental person anything other than what she herself wishes, or if we are treating with hypnosis, that is, only therapeutic suggestions. If we want to hypnotize for a scientific purpose, let us do so only with the permission of the hypnotized, without whose permission let us do nothing in this regard. The harmful influence of the hypnotist on the hypnotized appears in the dislike of hypnosis and the fear of the consequences of it. For example, hypnosis induced in a subtle way, but without the permission of the hypnotized person, can have the worst consequences. We have to give suggestions very carefully and often be satisfied only with the effect of hypnotic sleep. The suggestion must correspond to the ideational direction of the hypnotized person and must not be impracticable for him. Special suggestions must be in connection with general suggestions in terms of healing. Suggestions that could have a permanent adverse effect must be appropriately modified. If, after several hypnotic attempts, the subject shows a tendency to self-hypnosis, we must suggest that he is not allowed to sleep. Induced sleep does not depend on the hypnotist, but on the subject himself, or rather on his will to want to sleep. One can never hypnotize someone against his will if he resists falling asleep, but the hypnotist should have a magically developed will to which everything is subject. On the other hand, it is very easy to put a person to sleep without their knowledge, without their will, by a mere act of the hypnotizer's will. The duration and depth of sleep depends on the hypnotist. To deepen the sleep, we wake the subject suddenly but calmly and put him to sleep again, or we do several magnetic strokes. We do not hypnotize people who are laced up or dressed in constricting clothing, as blood circulation disorders may occur. Intelligent individuals, fiery temperaments with exuberant imaginations, as well as persons who know how to control, accustomed to obedience, such as soldiers, workers, etc., can be hypnotized very easily. On the other hand, hypochondriacs, neurasthenics, idiots, old people with weak brain activity are very unfit for hypnotism. Children from 4 to 15 years of age are very capable of being hypnotized, but they are very prone to simulation, with which they can often deceive even an experienced hypnotist. Up to the age of 30, the ability to hypnotize increases. After the age of 30, it decreases again. Many people think they haven't slept because they remember everything. They consider themselves simulants, and it is very difficult to convince them that they were asleep. We do not hypnotize persons suffering from heart disease, seriously ill, epileptic, hysterical, or prone to autosuggestion. Sleeping persons are very suggestible, but they are not suitable for experiments. We should never hypnotize a person who has consumed a lot of food or drink, as nausea may occur. Avoid using strongly shiny objects to hypnotize, and do not hold the object too close to the eyes, so that the subject is not forced to squint or to overexert the eye muscles, which often results in headaches. Sometimes it happens that the hypnotist, as a result of staring intently into the eyes of the subject, falls asleep himself, which can only be prevented by firmly fixing his thoughts on the intended goal. The hypnotist needs a strong will to be strong and persistent, an inner conviction about the power of hypnotic suggestion, and finally a belief in success. We never interrupt a dormant report without leaving it to unauthorized persons. The room where the experiment takes place should have a reasonable temperature, about 19 to 22 degrees Celsius. The position of the subject should be natural and pleasant. If nausea sets in, immediately give a counter-suggestion and wake up the subject. If the subject starts choking, he usually wakes up on his own. If not, then let's wake him up immediately. If she falls into convulsions, let's not wake her, but give her suitable suggestions, and only when she has calmed down, let's start waking her up. The same applies to fainting, in which we place the subject in a horizontal position with the head slightly lower than the legs. The hypnotized person is not quite a helpless tool in the hands of the hypnotist. He only accepts suggestions that are sympathetic or completely indifferent to him. We can say that a subject is only capable of such actions in hypnosis that he would be able to perform while awake. When giving a suggestion that is unpleasant to the test subject, the latter does not respond to it, or when it is persistently repeated, it falls into convulsions or wakes up. After awakening, let's deal with the experimental person for a few more moments, calm him down, and leave him only when we were absolutely convinced of his perfect awakening. Since the subject remembers after a longer or shorter period of time everything that happened to him during hypnosis, against which even the most energetic suggestions to forget do not help, all the actions of the criminal hypnotist can be discovered after a while. Chapter 2. The Significance of Suggestion in Charming. It cannot be denied that suggestion was a factor of considerable importance in Enchantment. We don't have to go to the gloomy Middle Ages for evidence. We can find enough of it around us, in today's modern society, which, in its odd presumption of mental independence, sings of freedom, liberty, and unrestrained spirit, is so tightly bound by the heavy shackles of all kinds of prejudices and many erroneous opinions. Earlier suggestions that still have a powerful effect on its mental life, that the consequences of this modern charm are felt in our lives not only in a religious sense, but also cultural. Thousands of hopeful lives perished earlier in the stinking dungeons of prisons and on the gallows. Thousands of innocent women cried out to heaven on the burning borders for revenge, only because the powerful of this world, blinded by the devilishly refined depiction of the horrors and torments of hell, with which the fanatical priesthood confused their heads, could not or did not want to free themselves from the influence of these satanic suggestions, and did as if on command what they themselves had threatened to do in lucid moments. And today, when the worldly power of the gods has been taken away from the priesthood and when humanity is hastily freed from mental slavery. The borders do not flutter without hearing the heart-rending screams and moans of innocently tortured witches, but the pernicious effect of the old religious suggestions rooted to the core, we feel to a lesser extent until now. Is not the religious frenzy the result of fantastic suggestions, aimed at the excitable nature of an unthinking yet honest crowd? Are not all conversions to this or that faith before death just the result of the action of ideas, already absorbed by the person with the mother's milk, which, revived in memories, act on the disturbed mind all the more powerfully and with the greater effect, the less resistance the dying person can offer to them as a result of the continuing decline of strength? And what about the famous lurid healings? Aren't they a document suggestive of reorganization forces? Recently I read in a clerical paper how a certain young man blasphemed the sacrament of the altar during a village entertainment, fell to the ground and died. Of course, the finger of God was immediately sought in the case. How do we explain this sudden death? It is known that rural youths, perhaps under certain circumstances very rowdy and excessively exuberant, are after all, as a result of bigoted rural religious education, so fanatically religious that at a given moment the strongest layer of rural fury breaks through and the inexperienced, and usually very naive young man, takes over the old religious ideas strongly instilled in him by his parents to the extent that he is almost monoideized by them. And now imagine to yourself such a danced and intoxicated village youth, who in a fit of exuberance utters blasphemous words, the meaning of which he may not even understand at first, and which probably arouses outright horror among his companions and friends around him. Certainly more prudent young men admonish him. Frightened girls give him bitter reproaches, and perhaps some older women remind him of the punishment of God, with which God punishes all blasphemers. How terrible a process is taking place in the soul of such a suddenly aroused young man. How powerful and different impressions alternate in his interior. How many thoughts of indescribable fear of God's punishment run through his heavy head in an instant. Only an experienced psychologist who is capable of analyzing mental movements in the smallest details can judge. At the end, all thoughts merge into a single thought, into the thought of inevitable punishment, of death, which almost demonically possesses the young man, breaking both his mental and physical powers, until he falls to the ground dead, exhausted and faint under the weight of this insidious and deadly suggestion. And who doesn't know the folk saying that a perjurer will die within a year? They used to die, nowadays hardly a single one. Here, too, the suggestion triumphed, disregarding, of course, cases of completely natural death that occurred as a result of causes already before the sworn oath. A completely natural process took place there, unrelated to the essence of the oath either logically or causally. Remorse of conscience, fear of the possible fulfillment of popular superstitions, etc., ate away at the unfortunate man so that he weakened mentally and physically, so that the weakened organism was unable to face the disease, which it would have perhaps defended itself at another time, and which, tearing apart now together with the annoying suggestion of his health, really put him in a cold grave within a year. Similarly, the effects of curses and blessings must be attributed to most suggestions. Who knows what upheaval can be caused in human life by mere words of encouragement, spoken by an influential, authoritative personality, who has ever witnessed the happy ending and resolution of an otherwise rather dramatic family story just as a result of the magically encouraging words of the head of the family, will understand that the words of an elderly mother, a worried father, uttered in great emotion when saying goodbye, words of infinite love, kindness and care, explaining to a beloved, child that the excessive pain felt by them at this serious moment, they are directly a talisman, giving him comfort in difficult moments and encouragement for the next journey in life. This consolation, this encouragement pours into his veins a new fire, a new strength. They are a source of perseverance, which results in an increase in the effective work performance. This in turn increases the wage. The increased income already allows saving. The saved capital keeps increasing and becomes the cornerstone of a happy material existence. Behold, the fruit of blessing, and let's see the unfortunate man, to whom his old father's withered lips, twisted by pain and impotent rage, curse him terribly. Cursed be you. Don't be lucky. At first, he is not aware of these terrible words, but after he calms down, those terrible words appear to him like horrible visions and monsters before his mental vision. They cloud every brighter moment, every happy moment in his life. And if he does not manage to face these thought monsters, if he does not manage to rise above them in a moral respect, and if he knows that his father's anger was just only provoked by him, his father's curse will become a mocking, insidious mental cancer, undermining all his powers and bringing him only pain and dissatisfaction. And it is known that with a weak character, it is only a small step from dissatisfaction to various fads or unpremeditated, imprudent actions. What a pancake harvest of curses! Doctor mentions the influence of suggestion on human health. Gerard Encausse, Papoose, in his work Elementary Treatise of Practical Magic under the heading, Rural Wizards and Suggestions. Among the sick at La Charite, there were two interesting cases which reveal the influence which certain country folk can have on people rather exciting. When we speak of country wizards, of these ointment makers, of these good women, representatives of the occult sciences now forgotten, our first idea is a smile and a reluctance to reckon with thousands of cases, told from cottage to cottage and burdened by the narrator imagery. But there is an interesting study to be made about the suggestions, accompanied by bizarre words, which are the real cause of the results of these magicians in small. Suggestion works only on excitable beings, and anyone, say what they will, adherents of suggestion in the waking state and its general effect, who makes a sorcerer laugh, escapes its influence. Both the patients in question are hysterical, and nothing happened to them until the suggestion came to them. The first of the patients, Aliska C., was brought to us on December 11th by her relative, who had already consulted numerous doctors about her, who treated her in various ways, but to no avail. Seated in front of the revolving mirror, she was soon fascinated, and from their transference healing could be combined with suggestion healing. Under this double influence, on the fourth day the numbness of the hand, from which she suffered, disappeared. But on the night of the fourth to fifth day, the patient suddenly became speechless. We hoped to remove the dumbness easily by the use of suggestion, but we tried in vain for 2 days the various methods of suggestion. They all disappointed. Then it occurred to us that the patient was being controlled by some older suggestion, which was destroying our ability to the extent that we achieved success. The lingering silence did not allow us to ask sick questions, so we resorted to an experimental loop. Having satisfied ourselves that the patient was carrying out all the suggestions except those relating to her illness, we suggested to her that the person who had done this to her was standing before her, and pointed to one of the inmates of the institution. The patient's face suddenly contorted into an expression of violent anger, and the supposed cause of her present condition could only with great difficulty approach her and order the patient in a loud voice to recover immediately, which she did. From the conversation between them we could judge this. The girl was the daughter of a man, considered somewhat of a sorcerer in the village. On the day when she was to leave for Paris to serve, her father, seized with a violent anger, cursed her, saying, "From today you will always be sick, and no one can cure you but myself." Until then, she had never been sick, never had hysterical attacks, nor any nervous disorders. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.